So I recorded about 20 minutes of OpenRCT2 footage today of me tossing together a quick track design for a looping coaster. I'm going to provide a little running commentary with the video here, with the hope that it might help or inspire you. I'll also be discussing the ways the game computes excitement, intensity, and nausea ratings for tracked rides. I've placed a link in the description to the ORCT2 GitHub wiki, where the developers line out the actual algorithms that are used in the game. It's up to you if you'd like to read that. I personally have chosen to mostly ignore it, simply because playing by the numbers would take some of the fun out of the design process. You know, getting down to exactly how many turns and inversions and what have you need to have a perfect coaster. Especially because the math in the game actually comes together so well and simulates actual coaster design that I don't feel the need to game it that way. So instead, I'm going to speak in more general terms. If you've read the instruction manuals for either of the two games, then what I say will sound at least a little familiar. So without further ado, we will get started. So I went ahead and loaded up OpenRCT2 here, and really our first decision lies right here on the main menu. When you're designing a coaster, a lot of the times you're going to be designing it within the scenario that you're working on. And I would argue that that's really the best way to do it, if for no other reason than you have your template around you with the really specific scenery and landscaping and other rides that you can design around, which will really give you a coaster that blends in with your environment a little better. That said, I am just going to design sort of the coaster on flat ground, just as a demonstration here. You might be tempted to use the Rollercoaster Designer down here in the toolbox menu here. I choose not to use that most of the time. OpenRCT2 might change this someday, but as it stands, you don't have any way to see how much money you're spending in there, which shouldn't really be a big deal when you're designing coasters, but it's certainly a factor. You also can't change terrain levels or add scenery or pathing or anything else to really kind of put the finishing touches on your ride when you're done with it. So I really prefer to just go into a scenario. Now, there are plenty of workbenches out there. For this video, I'm just going to use the Six Flags Park one that comes with Rollercoaster Tycoon 2 by default. There's really no reason I'm using this over anything else other than it's just what I've got. But now that we're in here, it's time to decide what kind of coaster we're going to design. I'm going to choose a looping coaster for this video. I will say too that this is all going to be one take. I'm hoping that maybe we can capture a little bit of my authentic thoughts as we're going through the design, because I feel like that might be helpful. So you might see that we make some decisions and then we go back on them, you know, say it like Bob Ross, there's only ever happy accidents, you know. But we will start here. I tend to start with an elevated station. That's usually just a personal choice, just because I can make a station that's about 6 segments long, and then I can immediately go into this little baby banked turn right here, which just kind of gets the ride going a little more quickly. Even though it's not something that's reflected in your stats for your ride, at least not expressly, the duration of your ride should certainly be taken into account. Because if you're playing in a scenario where they're paying per ride, obviously the faster you get them through, the more money you'll make. Whereas if you're playing on a scenario like this, where it's pay to enter the park and they ride the ride, then it might make sense to make it a little longer. It all falls to you, but it's an important decision to make. So I've started out with sort of a spiral downward banked hill here. I made my hill about 65 feet tall. That's usually about good for a looping roller coaster. You can get a little higher than that, but you usually want to float just around that 65, 70, 80 foot mark. And that's going to be true for most coasters. Giga coasters and some of those other bigger ones and smaller ones like the Virginia Reel are obviously going to be different, but as a baseline, 65 feet is good for a good first drop. On our first drop here, you'll notice that even though there is a change in direction here, it is one constant change in direction, right? Because one of the things we have to consider when we're designing these rides is our G-forces, right? I'm sure you're familiar with that, but it's basically what direction the guests in the cars are thrown around in as they're going along the ride. In general, positive vertical G's, that is the riders being pushed down into their seats, is not a big deal. You can generally get away with pushing those as high as you want. Negative vertical G's would be guests being pushed against the restraints on the top of their seats. There is an intensity penalty for that. Basically, if you have really high negative vertical G's, then you will have an intensity penalty. Same goes for lateral G's. For example, if I were to just put a really sharp turn in down here, then that train of guests is going to come down at some 40 or 50 miles an hour and rip around that turn. And that's going to cause a lot of lateral G-force, which is going to smush them against the side of their cars. And that's not what we want. That's going to give the most drastic increase in intensity. The ways that you can mitigate that, the best way that I like to think about it is I just want to keep in my mind an idea of how fast my train's going to be going as it gets to each individual section of track. And I'm thinking right now, okay, it's just come down 65 feet, so it's going to be going really fast. And so that's why I'm not actually going to change direction at all while I'm on the ground here. I'm going to sneak in an on-ride photo section. Contrary to what you might think is common sense, it actually doesn't matter where you place the on-ride photo section. Basically, if you have one and the guests enjoyed the ride, they will buy the photo, regardless of how poor the photo might have come out in real life. It doesn't matter necessarily where you put it, so it's kind of an aesthetic choice more than anything else. So I've placed that there, and now I've got my train going forward at some 50 miles an hour. So I'm gonna decrease some of that speed. So I'm gonna start an upslope here, and I'm gonna slant it. Right when I'm changing directions, you almost always want to bank turns, because banking turns is going to convert those lateral G's that push the guests to the side. It's going to convert it into those positive vertical G's that pushes them down into their seats. And if you recall, we don't really care about those. We can let those get as high as we want. So we can use a banked turn here. And I'm going to go ahead and curve it right up and back around, and that would be some nice symmetry, but I am going to run into the chain lift hill here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a straight section here, maintaining that banking. Just one more, and that's going to give me enough to make it back up. So when you have your hills coming up, you don't want to decrease the maximum height of each of your hills by more than 5 to 15 feet for each one. Generally, even at 5 feet, your trains are going to have a really hard time making it over the hills. But if you have too much speed going into it, then you're going to get some of those negative vertical G's, which are bad news. So 65 to 50 feet is a pretty good transition here. The cars are affected by friction, so they will slow down over time. So at this point, I'm gauging in my head that they're maybe going to be going like 15 miles an hour when they're at the top here, which means I could get away with pretty much anything I want to do. In this case, I am going to go straight back down. That's just, the choice I'm going to make here. And so coming all the way down, you might be tempted in a case like this to come the extra 5 feet all the way down here. This is sort of an aesthetic thing on my part, but I think this sort of makes the hill look ugly. So I would just as soon only come down to 5 feet above the surface here, because that way I can give a nice, smooth sort of parabolic curve there for you math guys. And that's going to open me up to all kinds of things. In this case, though, I'm going to do just one more of these bank turns. And I know I tend to favor these a little bit, but that's just something that I do. One thing you'll want to avoid, just aesthetically, you want to think about how many of each variety of turns your coaster has, right? So as it stands right now, my coaster turns left and then it turns right. Right? Now a common thing might be to just have it be left turns all the way through. And you might even do it without thinking about it, because it's a really good way to pack a whole lot of coaster into a small area. You want to do your best to avoid that, just because, especially if you're trying to design your coasters to be aesthetically pleasing. If you're the kind of person who notices it, you will notice it every time, and it'll kind of drive you crazy. So that said, though, I am going to come right back up here, and this will bring us to about 45 feet. Right, again, acceptable. Once again, I'm going to continue my banking here, and then I'm just going to roll right back down into a whole nother smooth turn. Right now, in the real world of coaster design, they actually call that an overbanked turn, and it's something closer to a loop that's placed on its side, and it's not something that the game can replicate, but it just kind of looks cool to me. So now we're back down here, and I figure since we're building a looping coaster, I'm gonna give myself a little more money here. since we are building a looping coaster, I figure let's put some loops in. So one of the many factors that the game will use to determine the excitement of your coaster is going to be what it drives past, what it drives through, what it drives around. Does it go underground? Does it go near the station? Does it go near paths? Does it go near scenery? Right? And all of these decisions are going to be big time in determining the excitement rating of your ride. So maybe I might want to sneak a loop in over the station, right? And that's kind of a daring move because then you have trouble placing entrances and exits in a way that looks good or what have you. But I figure I'll give it a try here and we'll see how it goes. So as I approach, I actually have two choices. I could have a straightaway here, which just doesn't really look all that good to me. So what I'm actually going to do in this case is I'm going to come up here and I'm just going to precede this with another loop. I'm going to do I believe a right loop will give me the direction that I want, right? And I can go like so, and then immediately come right back up again, go down here, and if we take another right loop, oh, maybe not. Positioning the loops can sometimes be a pain in the neck. It's just something you might never quite get used to it, but it is just sort of part of the game. So this is an important point I can make, right? Maybe I have this grandiose idea of what I want my coaster to do, and I can't pull it off. So in this case, as opposed to scrapping the whole coaster and starting again, as opposed to doing whatever else, I'm going to table that idea for now. So I'm just gonna back up a little bit and see where else I can take this. Right? Maybe I'll leave in that one loop that I had right there. And then instead of coming right around here, I'm going to go into a bank turn, right? Now you have a couple choices with bank turns. You can actually use regular old bank turns, or you can do a helix, right? And a helix is going to be a good way to buy 5 feet of difference when you need it. Like maybe you're trying to make your way back to the station, or you're trying to navigate your way through a loop, or you're just trying to get your track to go somewhere. If you find yourself 5 feet short, replacing 2 tracks like that with an upward or downward helix will take up the same amount of space, but will buy you that 5 feet in either direction, right? So that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing here, and then similarly, I'm going to kind of keep that going and go right in here. Now this I should be able to get through there. And like I said, this is going to buy you excitement points, pulling something like this, because the guests are going to see that they are going through the loop at one point, or maybe they're going around another car as they're going through. That's maybe not necessarily likely, but it's always possible, right? So that right there is one individual element that's pretty cool. And add that to our overbanked turn, and you already have kind of maybe our on-ride photo station makes 3. And we already have 3 sort of individual elements, right? And that's a way that some people tend to think of their coasters as they're designing them. They will add individual elements. It's a good mindset to have, because it means that everything that you're doing with a purpose. But at the same time, you don't necessarily want your coaster to be just a series of individual elements. You want to tie them together and combine them in interesting ways. So it's certainly just one or another way of thinking of things, but it's an important decision you kind of have to make. Revisiting our height changes, right? We went from 50 feet over here to a max of 40 over here, and I believe the coaster might actually have trouble clearing this loop. We'll have to see when it goes to test, but I believe that peak comes out at maybe 35 feet. I believe it's an extra 25 on top of the last height marker there. But that would mean it's coming up at 35, and then it's coming back around at 35 again. So that means that we are starting to lose a little momentum, right? As you're losing momentum, that's going to be your time to think about, okay, maybe it's time to bring this ride in. And so I'm going to do just that. When you bring a ride in, you don't necessarily just want to take the shortest path to the station platform. You want to see if you can make the journey back at least just as interesting as the journey going out. Like it won't be the greatest thing in the world, just because it doesn't have the speed, it doesn't have the allure, if you will. But you can do your best as a designer to kind of make that be something interesting, right? Just a side note, when Chris Sawyer, the developer of Rollercoaster Tycoon, was designing the game, he actually took inspiration from a lot of different amusement parks that he had visited over the years as a means to kind of give him ideas for his roller coaster designs that he put into the game. So now that we're here, we're getting pretty close, and maybe just a couple of turns would get us pretty close to where we need to be, right? We want to make sure that we are at even height, of course, and then as far as safety concerns for your rides go, you have a couple of different things to think about. You can use a block brakes system, which is going to be the most safe and eliminates all possibilities of crashes if you set it up properly. I don't tend to do it just because rides don't break down all that often, and if you only run 1 or 2 trains, then you very rarely have issues anyway. A very common breakdown, if you've played this game before, is the station brakes failure. So I'm going to place just a regular old set of brakes out here. And this is just going to slow us down to 13 miles an hour or so, which is going to be enough that we don't even have to bank that turn. We can just bring it straight in, and I'll add one more station platform for good measure. So we'll just kind of place these entrances and exits here while we're looking at this. But now that we've finished the ride, you have some choices that you can make. You want to take a look at how many trains you've got. I've got 2 trains at 7 cars per train. The longer a train is, the more exciting the ride will be. That's just sort of a factor that's used. Your chain lift speed is going to be important. It'll make the ride run faster at the risk of less reliability. I would recommend on every ride you have, all your roller coasters, your stationary rides, everything, set all the inspection times to 10 minutes and just hire enough mechanics to take care of it, because you're going to want that reliability to stay high for as long as possible. But now that we've set it up, we don't have to worry about theming or anything because we just want to see if this baby works. So we'll take a second and watch this. And as we can see, we can pay attention to the speed here. We see, yep, it makes it about 45 miles an hour at the bottom there, about 22 at the peak. Comes back around. It's maintaining pretty good speed all the way through. And it will clear that first loop. It'll clear it no problem, actually. So I guess my fears were unfounded. But we'll clear right through just like so. And come right around. And with that amount of speed, maybe we have the opportunity to do a little more with this coaster. As it stands, it's a little short. But since we went ahead and tested it, we may as well take a look at the ratings. Important things to note are, of course, excitement, intensity, nausea, which this is all right. Not my best work, but you want to pay attention to a couple things. Positive vertical G's, again, we don't mind too much. Negative vertical G's, negative 1.2 is not the biggest thing in the world. Lateral G's, again, not that bad. They will turn red if the numbers get so bad that they're going to really impact your intensity or your nausea, right? So that's just something to bear in mind. As long as those numbers are low, you're all right. The number of drops, the number of inversions, those are going to have direct impacts on your intensity and your excitement as well. So those are good numbers to pay attention to. In the meantime, though, I am going to go ahead and close this ride and see if we can't do something a little bit more interesting with our end section here. So I figure since it is a looping coaster, may as well have more than one loop. And we will do just that. And we'll take just a little bit of a roundabout way of getting to our destination here. While I am thinking about this, there is some degree of subjectivity to all coaster design. I'm sure at least a few of you guys have seen this video and think that this is a spaghetti monster, right? And I don't know if I would disagree with you. It's a coaster that will hopefully have good stats by the time we're done with it, but it's not necessarily the prettiest thing in the world. And that's okay. If your goal is just to design coasters that are entertaining to your guests, then this is kind of a good way to approach it. In a later video, I will do a sample coaster design while like in the midst of a scenario and show you how I take some of those scenario elements and into consideration to kind of take the ride to the next level. So since we've made that change, I'll go ahead and give this ride another test. and it will just barely clear that loop. Good. So let's see how we did. We got a little bit of improvement. We were at 5.4 or so, I believe, earlier, and we're up to 6.08. A general mark of a good roller coaster is going to be that the excitement is higher than the intensity, right? Not every coaster in the world has to have very high excitement, because most of them that do will also have very high intensity just by kind of the nature of the design. So something like this, it will be at least a little more cost effective than some of the bigger rides, and it'll kind of fill that niche for your guests that haven't built up the confidence to ride the bigger rides yet, which, spoiler alert, they get from riding these smaller ones. So now that we've designed this, the only thing that's there's a couple of finishing touches that are left to do, and I won't do too much on this just because it's better placed in another video. But we do want to go ahead and place our station platforms as well as maybe some scenery. Right, one of the factors, and I guess I'll keep the test results open while we do this so you can see, even the placement of your queue line will determine the excitement will have some kind of say in the excitement of the ride. And we can see that it's at 6.08 now, and it will come up at least a little bit before we're done, between the station pathway and the scenery and everything else. So you can have queue lines that kind of wrap around on each other like this. It's not the nicest looking thing in the world, but you can do it. One other note I will make is, especially if you're making a ride that's going to be specially like, I guess, made to be placed in all different manner of parks, it makes sense to kind of square off your pathway right here, simply because that makes it really easy to place. You can also, when you're designing, kind of pay attention to your dimensions and try to keep it within maybe like a 20 by 20 area or any number of things. If you're looking to just kind of have a ride that you can drop down, right? And you could spend hours doing this, honestly, and come up with all kinds of good things. Just a note: generally, benches and trash cans and such will not save with the ride, but I'm just putting them here for kind of demonstrative purposes. When you're coming off of a coaster, you always want benches so that the guests that are nauseous or riled up have a chance to sit and relax for a minute. I will almost always place a do not enter sign coming away from my exit path, just so my guests don't waste time walking all the way up there and walking all the way back. It'll also fix some issues with the pathing algorithm that they'll use, like the math that they use to calculate where they want to go. That'll be a topic for a later video as well. But now that we have this ride that is finished, as you can see, we've already had a little bump in excitement. But if you're ever at a loss for what kind of scenery to place around your rides, especially if it's something, generic metal roller coaster, kind of like you've got here, just a spat of sort of related looking trees never hurts. Maybe it doesn't quite lend itself to any particular theme, but it is just an easy way to add some excitement, and it's pretty cost effective. When you do that, you want to add big trees, as well as usually you can find these thinner ones. And finally, you can add shrubs. This also has the benefit of almost every scenario you play will have the standard trees, the standard shrubs, the standard pathways stuff, which means that you'll never be locked out of placing one of these in another scenario because you don't have that specific thing unlocked. So we can see that we've bumped up to 619, and you can add, I believe it's something close to like 3/4 of a point of excitement to a ride just by adding scenery to it, right? The other thing you'll notice maybe as you're designing coasters is if you decide to bring another ride close to this one, then this one will get a boost in excitement as well. There's a separate calculation that determines, okay, so I'm going near myself through all this, but then, oh, there's this other ride that comes through too. And that's another way to add excitement. So it's why it's usually so much better to just kind of design your coasters on the fly instead of trying to design them in this fashion. But if you do, that's fine. Last couple things you'll want to do: if you have admission prices, you'll want to set a price. Generally, when you have a brand new coaster, you can set an admission price that is the excitement rating, and guests will pay it. They will pretty quickly start refusing to pay that much once the ride begins to get old, but you can totally milk them for the money early on. They will pay the excitement rating. On-ride photo, they'll pretty much pay $2, $3, $4 depending. Your guests can only have one on-ride photo in their inventory, regardless of which ride they got it from. So you don't necessarily want to put one of those on all your rides because there is an upkeep cost associated with it. But looks like last couple things to do. We could play with colors. It's good to have music. The guests will perk up a little bit if they're around music of any kind, whether it's the merry-go-round or any other ride that's playing music. That said, if you have overlapping music, they'll complain. But last decision, we will give this a name, and I will choose something simple for this. Right. And just like that, we have something close to a finished coaster. You can save your track design in here, and you just choose select nearby scenery. We'll catch most of it. There's word in the pipes that OpenRCT2 is going to add something to kind of streamline this process, but it is kind of a pain in the neck to select all the extra scenery that it misses. By default, I think it grabs all the scenery within 4 tiles of the ride, like 4 tiles of a piece of track. So it gets most of it. But just like that, you can save it. I won't save this one, but you can save that and then plop it right back down. Final thoughts, like I said, I would recommend that you just design coasters. Design coasters for hours, use all different varieties of them, do them in all different kinds of environments. The best way to get better is just to practice. If you have a coaster that comes out with ludicrous stats like an ultra extreme intensity or something, if you really like it, instead of giving up on it instantly, you'll want to take a look at what's causing it, right? Usually it's going to be one of these 3 G factors. And then you can come over here to your graphs here and take a look at what's causing your G-forces when. Even changing just one turn could cause the excitement rating to double and the intensity rating to go down by 5 points. Because if the intensity rating ever gets red, as in it gets to extreme or ultra extreme, it will cut the excitement in half completely. And that's irreversible unless you fix that intensity. So you can make a really simple fix to kind of save a ride that you might think was doomed. This video ended up being a little longer than I intended, but I figure it was all right. Please let me know if you guys have your own thoughts about coaster design in the comments. This is far from an objective truth. This is just something close to the way I design coasters. I'll link some of my work in the description if I get to it, but I would encourage you guys to take a crack at it and start making your own creations. Thanks so much for watching.